Welcome to the Biz Coach Show, hosted by my Biz Coaches and presented by the TLG Group. Our show is focused on giving entrepreneurs the edge they need to succeed. Your hosts today are David Macon, that's me, and Eric Whitmore. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent, David. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. Well, always great to connect with you. And we've got some great stuff in store today. Before we jump into today's topic, we do want to invite you to subscribe and follow, whether that's on YouTube or your podcast player of choice. I want to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. And we'd love for you to connect with us online through social media and join our community. Today, we're discussing efficient expenses. Let's start by defining efficiency. We like to define efficiency as achieving maximum productivity with minimum wasted effort or expense. And so there's a couple things that we want to think about, or that we like to talk to small business owners about. One is, if you don't spend any money at all, you may never achieve max productivity. So that's kind of one side of the scale. On the other side is a point of diminishing returns, where you can keep pouring money into something and you're not going to get any greater productivity as a result of it, and you end up overspending. And so those are kind of two things we want to balance throughout our conversation today. But I think, Eric, as I think about a small business owner who's listening in or watching this, maybe they're struggling to differentiate between a necessary expense and an unnecessary expense. So what guidelines or maybe advice do you give a small business owner or one of your clients that you coach on that particular topic?
Yeah, interesting question, David. And I think a lot of it kind of stems from the idea, not to get into the semantics or the accounting that comes into play in a scenario like this, but there's expenses that happen. If you have a smaller business, let's say solopreneur, 1-2 employees, and it is you're an LLC, sole proprietor. I'm sorry, not sole proprietor, but LLC or
like an S corp.
Not even an S corp. Actually, an S corp's got more regulation to it. But anyways, you're operating not with a designation. And the point being is that in those scenarios, part of the reason why you run that small business is that you're looking for ways to reduce your tax exposure. Now, obviously, we're not accountants in here. We're not tax attorneys, so we're not giving tax advice. But when you have expenses that you incur throughout your business, they need to be part of your normal course of business, right? Which is one of the things that has a tendency to kind of get out of hand from time to time. So I bring that up initially just because it's a worthy conversation, and the whether or not people are actually doing it the way they should be, which is super important. But as we look to move from I would call it the lifestyle business into a true smaller business operation where you have employees and you're vetting your expenses, which is really what we're talking about here. And you're looking at saying, hey, what are we spending this, our money on? And what expenses are we incurring? Is there value? Often when we go in with a client, one of the things we'll sit down to try and help understand is where are we spending money that we don't necessarily need to, which is kind of what you're getting at. And a lot of that centers around, often, quite honestly, just what I find is most people who are struggling with their business expenses also have similar practices in their personal, the way they manage their personal finances. So for instance, if you have a lot of services, monthly services, it could be marketing services, it could be networking type services, things like that you don't actually use on a consistent basis. You only use occasionally, or but yet you look and you're getting tagged every month, 30, 50, $100 a month, depending on how big your budget is and what your willingness to allow those amounts to kind of hang around, right? You can, in your head, you kind of justify, well, I used it 3 months ago. Is it still worth $100 a month at that point? And so I think that's one of the things that we look at often is that we find people that are spending things that they needed at one point, but do they really still need it now? I think that's one of the things that we often find is those recurring expenses, any kind of software application, any kind of networking service, something like that. And then there's, other things like literally about 6 months ago, I realized we were paying in my business, we were paying for an eFax number. And my wife had needed it, 3 years ago. And so we signed up for it. And I'm like, why are we still paying for this? And it's $17 a month. I'm like, yeah, it's probably time we just kind of cut that loose. And honestly, it was one of those things where it took, I'm going back and I'm looking through the numbers that I'm doing. It wasn't year end. I was probably looking at like third quarter. I'm looking at the numbers. I'm like, it doesn't sound like a lot of money, but when you start aggregating that over probably 27 months that we paid for that we probably only needed it once in 27 months, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of a waste of money. So, I'm not sure I completely answered the question, but I think that's one of the things is when you're looking at what are you really getting a return for? But I think that's a trap that a lot of business owners fall into is I used it, I needed it at one particular time, but I haven't gone back and really used it. Or worse yet, there are business owners that get services, get solutions, software solutions are off their, one of those, to make it affordable, they pay monthly and they'll sign up for it. And then they never actually use the full capacity, which is another thing. It's a huge inefficiency that we find that people have a tendency to do.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, right? When you talk about necessary versus unnecessary, comes down to, not only are you using it or not, I think that's, very practical, but also what's the return you're getting from it. So I think kind of touching on that a little bit too, certainly important. And I think it's interesting, right? You talk about, $17 charge, that's not a lot, but oftentimes to your point, right? That's just one of many things that kind of add up to several $100s or thousands of dollars. And if you've got multiple employees and maybe they're making purchases or they're subscribing to software, all of a sudden that problem becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And so super important to have that kind of checks and balances in place and making sure you're watching your kind of your cash flow, right? And how quickly you're burning through some of those reoccurring expenses. Just one other thought too, as you were talking about it, thinking about software, I literally just did this the other day, but different pricing models, right? So oftentimes, people
Absolutely.
are not sure, hey, I'm not sure if I'm going to use it or not, so I'm just going to go monthly. And then you forget about it, kind of like a gym membership, right? And you end up paying for it every single month, even if you're not using it. So I think one of the things that is really helpful is, software goes on sale, or if you do annually, you can get, 3 months free, things like that. So if you're not sure if you're really going to use it or not, maybe start with the trial and then take advantage of those trial offers that often come up where, if you sign up at the end of the trial, you can get a couple months for free. And you do that over a couple subscriptions. Maybe you got 10 licenses on that platform. You can actually save quite a bit of money. So just a couple of thoughts there that you sparked for me as you were talking through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, that's probably one of the big things. And to your point, that the reality is that spirals quickly once you start having employees, right? You start bringing in 5, 6, 7 people. Another great one is software licenses. When you like, for instance, if you're using Office or Google and you've got email seats and or QuickBooks, or if you're, especially if you're using like an enterprise version of QuickBooks for people who still use that, those are expensive seats to have in a software application like that. And what happens is, companies ebb and flow, right? And they lose people, they gain people, and nobody really keeps track of those things. We both came from the wireless industry, and I can tell you that there are many times where we would sit down and analyze somebody's account in the wireless business, and we would analyze somebody's account and realize, oh, you know what? You're still paying for 3 phones that you haven't used in 6 months. And if you remember back in those days, we're talking, 50, 60, 80, $100 a month, depending on the platform and what it was being used and what software they were using. That's a lot of money that adds up really quick. And so, you almost need somebody within the organization that's their sole responsibility. Once you get north of 5, I would say 5 employees, that becomes a very unruly task, and you get north of 10 employees and it spirals quickly. So it's something you really have to dig into, because those simple little expenses, and it's a lot of it, like I said, is centered around per user software applications, or where a lot of that comes into play. And all it takes is, 1 or 2 people, you forgot about them and you pay for them for months at a time and realize, we just dropped $1,500.
Yeah. Right.
And then you take that and you extend that out over a 10, 15, 20 person sales team or organization of some sort. And now all of a sudden, let's say everybody's using, I'm trying to think of Adobe so that you can edit PDFs. Let's say something as simple as that, right? I think it's $20 a month. But say you have 3 people actually use it, the other 17 don't use it. At $20 a month, that's $340 a month over the course of a year. It's like $4,000.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just simple things like that people take, don't think through and aren't vetting. And then, so ironically, I'll take it one step further. And I hate to keep beating this up, but think about, to your point, the real value. Go to the next level organization. Go to a multi-100 employee organization. What does that look like where you have just one person spending $50 outside of what they should be spending a month, and multiply that by 100, 200, 500 people? Those have become some seriously meaningful numbers after a certain point. And we watched that happen in organizations we both worked in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting what you jogged my memory, Eric. You probably remember this. Office supplies, right? Just
Yes.
One of those things that you don't think, people are going to take advantage of. They're going to, manage, have good stewardship over it. And then you start looking at, what's actually being ordered. I think we can all agree toilet paper is a necessary expense, right? I don't think anybody would argue that. But how much, right? Do we need to stockpile, 20, 30, 50 rolls a month? No, right, is the answer. So it's kind of like, it may be well-intentioned. We don't want to run out, super important. But at the same time, there's kind of this, again, that balance of necessary versus unnecessary. And sometimes quantities become a factor there as well. So it's just, cases of water, toilet paper. I mean, how many pens does one, department need, right? Some of those things. And it seems trivial, but, as you grow, that's money that could be fueling your growth. That's just going into, some vendor's pocket. So something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned that, go one step further. We had a relationship with an office supplier. I won't go into the company, but and they had a recommended list of items that we could purchase, right? And that was determined by the company. The company determined recommended items. You go through the recommended list of items and look at some of the things that were on there, and they were probably on there for those one-off scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Well, but the problem is that particular item was $50 more than if I went and walked into a Walmart and bought this exact same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember. I think a vacuum was on there. I want to say things like staplers that you could buy at Walmart, you could buy for $6, $8, $10 were worth $25 through this supplier.
Yeah.
And it was, I'm sure it was a better quality, right. But when you're in our environment, the business we were in, it was like, it's a stapler. Yeah. It's going to last 3 to 6 months before it walks away or it gets broken.
Yeah.
We'll replace it with another $6 or $8 stapler,
Yeah. 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 Well, and you bring up a good point too, right? I think it's important to think about the vendors you're using, right? Different vendors have different, cost control measures available, whether that's, software as a service or, physical products like office supplies. So, shopping around to see what exists out there and what reporting's available too, right? That's one thing that sometimes is a struggle is, can I see who's using the licenses? How many hours did they log? How many orders were placed? What was the cost of the average order? So, some of those things kind of matter. So if you're, starting a business, definitely do your research before you get into a relationship with a vendor. But once you're in one, really take the time. I think we've talked about this a number of times, but at least once a year, review the vendors that you have relationships with and kind of think about, are there better options out there that have more features that, can save you money?
Yeah, agreed. And you mentioned a great point, right? If you're using a vendor like that, they should have a vendor solution that allows you to aggregate the data based on, by location, who's spending more money for the particular services, because you can, if you've got multiple locations, for instance, a multi-unit retail operation or something like that, who's overspending on certain categories of items or whatever, you can actually track all of that, which by using one of those vendors, usually that has that ability to do that. Otherwise, you have to do it through your own accounting processes.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So cool. Well, let's kind of dive a little further into that, Eric. I think as we're talking about scale, I think, let's maybe unpack just a little bit more. What are some of the challenges that are presented when it comes to managing expenses as a company scale. So if they're in the process of scaling, why is it important to closely manage those expenses, but what are some of the pitfalls that owners fall into?
Yeah, we probably want to unpack the pitfalls, but let me initially start with the idea that in regards to, first of all, an owner, generally speaking, I don't think this is always the case. I know it's not always the case, but generally speaking, the first person out, the first operation, the first business model, the first unit, whatever you want to call it, is usually pretty disciplined about managing expenses.
Yeah.
Right. The issue becomes when you start scaling, as you step away from some of those things and you begin to lose sight of that level of detail. And the further you get removed from that level of detail, the more that has a tendency to kind of squirrel out of control.
Yep.
Right. And consequently, now, what we were spending a few dollars for, somebody's spending multiple more dollars for, and kind of gets out of control. And for each level of extension that you become from that first unit, you could expect somewhere between a 10 to as much as I would say the lower end, maybe 5%, but as much as a 15 to 20% variation from what you were able to sustain. So if like, say, for instance, if an operating unit had an average office supply expense of $150 a month, you the first level of separation from that, from a management and an oversight, for the first level extension beyond that, you're looking at, I would say realistically, probably a 10% variation. So what you were doing for $150, the next person's going to do at $165. Just they don't have the inherent built-in sensitivity to managing those types of things. It wasn't their dollar.
Right.
Even with the best stewardship, it's still not their dollar. Right. And then, so for each level beyond that, you can extend 10, 15, 20, even as much as 25%, depending on how disciplined your processes and systems are and how you regulate those things. So imagine as an owner of a multi-unit operation, you extend beyond 3, 4, 5 levels of leadership. You've got a rep, an assistant manager, a store manager, a district manager, and then the operations organization group or whatever, and then the owner, right? So now you're 6 levels out. Imagine a 10 or 20% variation from that initial cost.
Yeah.
Now, theoretically, you've got those processes and systems to help keep that in check, but the reality is you just get that much more removed each time. And a lot of times that gets lost in translation. But if you use that metric, if you use that logic, that for every realm of extension that you move back from the initial unit, you're losing about 10% of your ability to control. And that goes to everything. It goes to your ability to leverage sales increases and all that kind of stuff too. For every level you step away from the business operating unit, that much less you have control in everything you do. But expenses is one of the things that can spiral quickly out of control.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you and I both have worked in a number of startups and consulted with a number of startups. And it's really interesting, right? Because when you're in those early days, you remember the pain of, oh my gosh, are we going to make payroll? Some of those, big struggles that every dollar really counted. And to your point, as you get bigger, people come in, they weren't part of the lean years, they're part of the fat years. And so they're just used to there always being money and, things seem really good. But, the people that are around at the beginning, to your point, they have a much greater cost sensitivity and understanding that, it hasn't always been like this. And I think in the back of your mind, it may not always be like this if we're not careful. And I think it's important to cascade that as a leader throughout your organization too. And, you're never going to recoup all of that, the percentage difference that you talked about as you get further away, but the more you can kind of keep an eye on it and kind of cultivate that mindset of scrappiness, I think what you and I both have and appreciate, I think it's going to help the organization too as it grows.
Yeah, absolutely. The second point you brought up, and I'm trying to remember what it was. You'd mentioned the
pitfalls. Yeah, pitfalls.
Yeah. And I think that when you say pitfalls, give me an extension of what you're thinking in that.
Yeah, I think I'll maybe start with one, and that may spark some ideas. But
Yeah.
I think sometimes what I've seen is, if business is booming, right, and we're growing and we're hiring people, and opening new locations or expanding into new territories, whatever that looks like, I think there's a tendency to equate growth to profitability, and those two
Oh,
aren't always the same. And so,
yes.
you may overspend on marketing, or you may pay way more than you need to acquire a consultant, or not a consultant, well, maybe a consultant, but a client, or employee. So you kind of get in this like spend happy. It's almost like an addiction of, we're growing, so I'm going to keep putting the money out, and hoping the machine keeps paying out, and it doesn't always happen. So that's just one thing that comes to mind for me. I don't know if that resonates or sparks anything with you.
Absolutely. I would extend on that. To your point, there is a natural propensity in general for everybody within the organization. Again, I'll use levels of removal from the core unit, right?
Yeah.
So again, whoever your core unit is, let's just say for the sake of argument, it's the owner and the first 5 employees, right? They get the first business unit started or whatever. Extend beyond that circle to the next group, to the next group, to the next group, right? You get 2 or 3 levels out, and everything just gets beyond that. What also happens, to your point, and I think that's where you're kind of leading to, is now what happens is the people that came in the second, and even more specifically the third, fourth, and fifth evolutions of hires, right? And by the way, a lot of your core, maybe not a lot of your core, but part of your core isn't still with you anymore.
Right.
They may not have made it through those lean years, right?
Yeah.
And so, they got burned out or they moved on or whatever. But the point is that, so now what's happened is you're trying to stay true to your core. And as that evolves, what happens is not only do you lose the sense of discipline for certain things, but in addition to that, there's a misleading perspective that we're adding stores. And often when you grow at any reasonable scale, often the owner has to go into the coffers and either borrow, meaning taking on debt, or an investor to bring money in to be able to scale at that rate. Or if they do it in-house, like we did it with our last organization, we did almost all of our growth in-house with our own capital infrastructure, or our own capital resources. But what happens is the people come in the third, fourth, and fifth realms. They're like, oh, well, look at this. We have look how big we are. We have all this money.
Yeah.
Right. But what they don't understand is that the business is operating on let's just say a 10 or a 12% net margin. So for every dollar you're bringing in, you're only keeping 10 or 12 cents. They don't see that. Right. And so, and so again, you're talking, that's a percent, right? So if it's 10 or 12%, and if I told you that for every realm you step back from the core unit, you're losing 10% of right? You're reducing sales by 10%, you're increasing expenses by 10% because it's called slippage is the best way to call it, right? It's just slipping away from your basic control. Now, all of a sudden, as you scale back on that, each progressive unit doesn't bring the same amount of profits that the first unit did.
Right.
And each time that you add an additional unit, now because you're spreading your quality of talent, you're increasing costs just by the nature of having to have what you need to have at the time that you need it, and you're spreading out across multiple units. When you go to scale, things can get out of hand really quickly. I noticed you had inventory on here later on too. That's another big factor. When you scale, you're guessing at what you can expect to see, right? Until you actually get some real trends going, you're kind of guessing at what some of that's going to look like. You may overhire, for instance, on a new location. We've only done that a handful of times, right? So there's a lot of things that get out of control the further you remove from the business. So it's super important in a multi-unit operation to really keep your hands on everything that goes into each new store. You remember some of our peers. I lived in the field because I needed to truly understand what was going on in my stores. And I think that's one of the things that really helped me stay in control over my stores. I think that's one of the big factors as well. Is that, like I said, things scale out quickly, and control becomes a major factor when you begin to add more locations and things like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think what came to mind, the visual as you were talking about it, is like a rocket launching from the surface of the earth, right? The amount of fuel it takes to just break gravity is so extreme. People that are riding it maybe don't understand that. They're, the rocket's going great. We're getting some altitude. This is awesome. They don't realize how quickly they're burning through that fuel reserve. Kind of
Right.
same thing for a business. You're burning through capital, you're burning through, margin. Sometimes maybe you're discounting to, have an aggressive offer, right? So there's all these things that come into play that people don't always understand. And to your point, the further you get out, the less understanding there is of all aspects of the business. When you're there, when it starts, you're wearing 10 different hats and you understand a lot of different departments. But later on, if you're hired to do just one job, you may not think about all those other factors. Or if, you hire new people, young people who don't have a lot of business experience, they're not going to be thinking about those things either. So I think just, again, important to, watch that burn rate, because it's the real deal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so you touched on inventory. Maybe we shift gears there a little bit. I was as we were prepping for this, I was thinking about your ice cream business, right? I know that's inventory intensive, and you got to keep it cold and all those other things. And I'm sure there's a fair bit of shrinkage, either from it melting or maybe popping a pint open and eating it. But what are some of the mistakes that you see companies make when it comes to inventory management?
Yeah, so I'll tell a couple of stories real quick, and I'll use since you brought it up, the ice cream business. So in the ice cream business, and I remember I was young, 20s, and what was interesting about that was the buying inventory was super strategic. Yeah, as you can imagine, right? Ice cream in itself has a general shorter shelf life, right? And if the particular brand that we sold at the time was a natural product, an all natural, which was at that time was really popular. It still is popular. Just it was the fact that it was all natural was super popular, but it also reduced the shelf life by 6 months of what the competitors were. So if the competitor was good on the shelf for 12 months in ideal frozen condition, ours was 6. So now, generally speaking, that's not a major issue as long as you're in a high turnover environment. But if you put a particular product in a low turnover environment, meaning it just doesn't sell through the same volume as much, you have to be conscious of that and make sure that you don't let that become an issue, because then you're on the hook if this stuff goes out of code.
Right.
Because if an independent contractor with a vendor like that, they expect you to absorb any shrinkage that because of that type of scenario. So, meaning you allow it to get out of code because you're responsible for rotating your own inventory. So what ended up happening, and now remind you, I'm young, super young, 21, 22, 23. And so, I talk about being disciplined at a young age. I'm like, you got to think about stuff like that. Right. But what was interesting about the business model is that I had grocery stores on one end. There were lower volume grocery stores, but bigger as far as the turnover and scope, versus my other clients were predominantly convenience stores. And many of them had the same products. For instance, we had in between, I had some, so I had convenience stores on one end, I had grocery stores on another end. And then in the middle, we had our pharmacies, the Walgreens, CVS, things like that. And so we carried in Walgreens at that time, we carried Walgreens. Back then, Walgreens private label ice cream, but they also carried some of these other brands that we managed at the time. So, and it was brands like Haagen-Dazs and Ben & Jerry, or not Ben & Jerry, sorry, Breyers, Haagen-Dazs were two primary brands that we carried. And then anything Carnation Dairies, which is all the ice cream, like the Snickers ice cream bars and stuff like that. So, I mean, we had all the great stuff. What was interesting though, is if you don't understand what sells in what stores, and you didn't invest the time and energy to understand that, you could completely buy all the wrong products for a store that could do really, really well. For instance, I would have for a Walgreens, I would go in any given week and I'd put $500 worth of product in that Walgreens. And generally speaking, we're about a 20% margin of profit on that $500. So if I spent 20 minutes in that store putting $500 of product in that Walgreens, I made at 20% $100 profit on that store on that day. And that was one of my better Walgreens. But at the same time, if I had not stocked that with the right product, and I put different product in there, and I know this because the person who had that same store before I took over that route got a fraction of the sales that I got, literally less than 50% of the sales that I got. And it was because I recognized the demographics of that particular store and what they were buying in that store. And just by having the right product mix in that particular store, I was able to 100% increase the sales in that store. There was no salesmanship. It's just literally knowing what my clients were looking for.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And then now literally go 4 miles south of that store to a different store. It's a Hispanic targeted grocery store. Completely different product mix. Completely different product mix. If I put the same products that I had put in the Walgreens into that grocery store, I'd have never sold anything. And consequently, that particular store was doing $1,500 a month in volume. But completely different brands, completely different product mix, completely different flavor mix, whatever. So it's interesting when you talk inventory because it's all about knowing who you're selling to and what you're selling. So if you have a product-centric business model, understanding your inventory, and by the way, the only reason I was able to track all of this, one, I'm actually relatively good, and I won't say I have a photographic memory, but I was definitely very good at being able to memorize those types of things. But I also was very disciplined in going back and looking at my invoices and tracking what I was doing each week in those stores, and I begin to see these trends. So I was disciplined enough to go back and look at that stuff. And so that helped me dramatically, whereas some of my peers in the same business weren't doing that. They would throw in whatever, was on whatever I got in my truck, that's what I'm putting in this store. And then they'd be disappointed with their sales performance many times. So and all of it in that business model, very little of it revolved around my ability to sell, and it was more along the lines of recognizing what was in fact selling and then making sure that I stocked accordingly. So you want to talk about inventory management, that was like on steroids. If you didn't pay attention to what was, because you don't have, unless I stood there for hours and watched who was buying what products were being sold at that store, I'd never, be able to understand that. But by going back and look at my inventory trends and see what was selling and not selling, I was able to stock it accordingly. And then one step further, as we're talking about efficiencies, I recognize that certain products, when they went on sale, on a large scale, when the manufacturer would put a product on sale, I could actually buy in bulk and stock it. So I could actually go to the warehouse facility that we use to keep all our stock in, and I would say, hey, I'm going to buy a whole bunch of this stuff while it's on sale and be on sale for like 2 weeks. And right before the end of the sale, I'd used extra dollars that I had accumulated to buy inventory. I'd buy a bunch of it while it was on sale. That way, when the price went back up, I had that extra margin of profit built into my pricing, and I could leverage that. Now, I couldn't change the pricing with certain models, with certain stores, but in other stores I could. And so when it was on sale here, I would buy cases of it, we called sleeves of it, of the half-gallon ice creams or whatever, and I would have stockpiles of that I could actually hang on to for a month or two that I had bought at the lower price point and make the extra, I don't know, maybe it was 3 or 4% profit margin. But when you're operating on a 20% profit margin, you add 3 or 4%, that's a lot of extra leeway.
Yeah.
So that's a great example of, really kind of understanding your inventory flow and really investing the time. And this is long before computers, by the way. This is like early 90s. We didn't have, I wasn't even familiar with Excel enough to be able to build out a model that would have been able to do that at that time. It was all just going through my invoices and tracking it all. Man,
imagine what technology's done to that industry.
Good Lord.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, as you're talking about that, Eric, one of the things I was thinking about was, obviously you had that great insight and you were very hands-on with it, and being aware of purchasing prices and stock levels and all those sorts of things. And I'm thinking, again, going back to scale, as companies are scaling, one of the things that naturally happens, and we've kind of touched on already, is you start to have less and less control and less controls in place. And so I think, as we talk about inventory management, you've got to make sure that as you're growing, your policies, your procedures are growing with you. Otherwise, you're going to lose those tight controls. And all of a sudden you start to get that shrink or slippage, as you said, creeping into your business. So super important to kind of keep that in mind. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about, that, you've got to be very intentional about. Otherwise, it is going to happen.
Yeah, I'll go one additional story just to add on with the wireless industry. One of the things that people didn't realize about the wireless industry, as much money as we made in the days when we were making real money in the wireless industry, I mean, like serious money, one of the biggest challenges was cost of goods sold. So inventory management, right? And more specifically, the issue became, in the early days, it wasn't so bad because you could have a phone and it would be on market. It would be a viable product to sell for a year or two, maybe even 3.
Right.
If I at the early days, right? You remember the early days of the industry, you would have a phone that would be popular for a few years. Later, at the end of the time in the industry, I mean, you'd have a phone and 3 months later, its replacement was coming out.
Right.
I mean, as ridiculous as that sounds, that was literally how at one point that was very much like that. Right.
Yep.
And that was, and that was a major a challenge, because in the having had my own wireless entity for a period of time, I recognized that my cost of goods sold was running somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 58%. And that got exacerbated if I got too deep in any particular handset that ended up being a dud. Yeah. Which I don't there were a lot of phones that came out in the first 10 or 12 years of my career before we went to work for our last company. And because the unique thing about our last company is our last company had, if you remember, we had that specific agreement with T-Mobile that allowed us to consignment.
Yep.
So we had a consignment agreement where we didn't have to pay for the inventory until the inventory was sold. And there were times where we shipped phones back, and then they would assume the responsibility of, deploying that equipment elsewhere and doing what they did. In the early days of the wireless industry, in a dealership relationship like we had, if there was stock that you got stuck with because you bought it because you thought it was going to be really cool, I'm going to say like the Palm Trio, and you thought that was really awesome and everybody was going to love that phone, and then come to realize that nobody was going to part $500 for that phone. Eventually you sold it when the phone was down to $149. The problem was you bought it at a cost basis that by selling it $149, you were actually using up almost your entire profit margin.
Yeah.
And you were just literally happy to sell it and not be stuck with the inventory.
Yeah.
So it was like a zero profit sale at that point. You were just literally happy to unload the inventory and not take a loss on it. Yeah, and the carriers were not in the habit of writing down your inventory losses for you. So that was a big cost if you didn't know how to manage that.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Eric. I remember, a number of the situations you're talking about, but I think there's, maybe within the wireless industry, there's a parallel that a lot of companies trap a lot of companies fall into, which is, kind of burying their head in their sand on like customer demand and things like that. So I remember there were a number of companies that kept kind of clinging to BlackBerry, not to get too nerdy here, but, and they were just, eventually people would see the light and they kept buying these BlackBerry devices and there was no demand for it. Everybody was going Android or Apple, and there was a flash in the pan with Windows, but, people were diehard BlackBerry fans and they just refused to believe that brand was going to die. And then eventually it died. Right. And so they're stuck with this inventory that they can't offload because there's no demand for it. So I think really important with inventory, going back to your ice cream example, understanding the trends, understanding the customer, where things are headed, and making sure your purchasing and your pricing reflect that.
Right. Absolutely.
I really love BlackBerry for a long time, so I'll throw that in there. We're not sponsored by BlackBerry, but they had a good product back in the day.
Yeah, I carried it for 15 years. I loved my BlackBerry. I had a BlackBerry when it was just the pager.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah. As I get told, I'm dated here.
That's awesome. Anything else on there before we move on to the next topic?
No, I think we kind of beat up inventory.
Yeah. It's it's an important one. It will beat you up if you're not careful. So it's a good one.
Absolutely. Like I said, you operate a business that has 50% cost of goods sold, and then you add labor on top of that, which is typically going to run a third of your costs. You're already below the 20% threshold that you should be shooting for a net profit margin, not an operating profit margin. Right. So if you're a third labor and 50% cost of goods sold, you're already less than 20%. So you're going to be tough turning a profit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to revisit something we talked about. We're talking about it kind of in the context of software, but I think this is a more applicable concept to more areas, and that's negotiating payment terms. And so as we're talking about expense management, which of course, has impacts to cash flow and a number of other things, any advice for small business owners that are, maybe stuck in some payment terms that aren't favorable to them, or just general advice about negotiating payment terms with suppliers?
Yeah, I think that the first thing I would say there is doing your due diligence. If I look at my trucking business, even my wireless business, I would say that some of the main things that I recognized: partner with people who value your relationship. I know that sounds, super, almost corny, but the reality is that that's where you're going to create those favorable terms. Often what you find when your business is in alignment with your partners, your vendor partners, when their ideal customer is similar to your ideal customer and you guys are in alignment, you'll find that your vendors are much more amenable to strategic agreements that work in your favor, meaning getting better terms, 30-day terms or even 45 and 60-day terms. If you buy a certain volume, I think the other thing, for instance, I have a few clients, and one of the opportunities, a few clients in this scenario, I should say, and one of the opportunities that they have is they buy a lot of products from a lot of different vendors.
Yeah.
And with that, then you don't have any alliances. And without alliances, you lose the ability to leverage your negotiations. Right. And so the deeper you get in trying to be all things to all people, this is the analogy. The more you try to be all things to all people, the more you lose. Right. And so by developing and retaining those strong relationships with key vendors that are in alignment with who you're serving, again, they're serving the same people you're serving. And I don't mean that from a fulfillment perspective, meaning you're competing against, but they're looking at, right. And the point being is that when you do that, you will find that those vendors are the ones that are most amenable to creating unique agreements that will really allow you to benefit from that situation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, yeah. I think about that. I mean, yeah, it doesn't even have to be, a large vendor. I think about hotels that I've booked training rooms in, and print service providers, things like that, they're willing to work with you, and maybe not always price, because I think that's of course important. We're talking about expenses, but sometimes the level of service or the ability to get things done quickly, things that you would normally pay extra for, they'll give you at, a deep discount or even complimentary because of the relationship. So I've certainly benefited from that for a number of years with a variety of different vendors. So yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on.
Yeah, great point. I'll use one example with the trucking business. One of the challenges that we have in the trucking industry is that you have a truck, and the truck needs to be serviced on a regular basis because you're putting so many miles on it. And so when you're putting the rate of miles that you are on a truck, you have to have it serviced, pretty regularly, almost like every other week to at minimum once a month, depending on what your service. It could be brakes, could be tires, could be lights, could be whatever. And so what ends up happening over time is you get into a situation where, it's like if I need to be on the road Monday through Friday, theoretically, or let's say Sunday night through Friday morning, Friday midday or something like that, because they don't accept deliveries on Sundays and seldom do on Saturdays. So what would happen is you want your service to get done on Saturday and Sunday, not Monday through Friday. If I'm getting my services done Monday through Friday, that means those are hours that my truck's not on the road making me money.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so the biggest challenge we had was finding a vendor solution that would actually service our trucks on the weekends. Well, ironically, in the particular area of the United States where we operated, and the particular area that we were in specifically, many of the vendors that we used for that type of service also had their own trucks on the road. So they also did repairs for their trucks on the weekends. So they didn't service clients Monday through Friday. So finding a vendor that was willing to at least give us Saturdays that they would work on our trucks. And then we were able to work side agreements with some people where they would have a guy would come in and we would pay him directly, but they were allowed to use the service bay of that facility. And consequently, we were able to get, when it was little stuff, like I said, it was replacing tires and things like that. But it was just stuff that needed to be done, because if it happened, if we fixed it, this is what I found out the hard way after about 4 or 5 months in the business. If we fixed something in the shop when the truck was in our shop, where we had control of the situation, we could do, like, say, a blown out tire. We could do it for $150, $200 tops. If it happened out on the road, it would cost me $1,000 for a mobile service delivery, and they charge me whatever they charge me for the tire, right? So, it was worth it for me to pay a little bit more to have somebody have available on a Sunday to do that type of work. So again, to negotiating those relationships and having, people that are willing to work with you. I was willing to pay a little bit more than maybe somebody else, because they were doing it on a Sunday in a day where I needed to get it done so my truck could get back out on the road and not be slowed down or held up or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And, I think not necessarily something people think about when they're talking about efficient expenses is actually managing relationships, because those two definitely go hand in hand.
Great point. Yeah, great point.
Well, and on that, just to kind of bring us home before we get into a couple of key points and action items here. Another thing that people don't necessarily equate to expense management, but I think is an important talk track for us to discuss within this topic, which is generosity as the business owner. So any thoughts on how generosity ties into expense management, maybe things like bonuses, et cetera?
I think it's a great point. It's funny, when I read the outline, I was like, that's it. Dave's getting interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. It's a cool way to look at it, quite honestly. Yeah. So as you know, we've been friends for a long time. As you know, I am a huge proponent for performance-based rewards, meaning right, compensation, performance-based compensation, let alone performance-based rewards. But my point being is that at the end of the day, I'm all about, if somebody performs above and beyond, I want to be able to reward them in my structure, my model, the way that I run my business. And consequently, I think a lot goes into that. You mentioned the word stewardship earlier that we both learned in our previous employer. And one of the things that was significant for me about that is I had always been that way. I didn't know there was a word that actually demonstrated what it was until I was taught that concept. And I don't know that I didn't know it beforehand, but I never heard it employed the way that we used it. And to that point, when being a good steward of the business, that was a huge component of our success at our previous employer. Having people have stewardship for the business, and that played out in my opinion in our ability to really kind of own our businesses.
Yeah.
Right. And when somebody owns their business, and I say our business, it's like you managed the training department, right? I managed my territories, whether it was the Southwest or the Northwest or whatever. And in those territories, I'd have anywhere from 35 to 45 stores, right? And in those stores, then my district or directors would have ownership over their regions. And the store managers would have ownership over their stores, demonstrating that stewardship. And the beauty of that was that the owners had a performance-based compensation structure built into how well the company did. And a lot of those key players at those decision-making positions benefited from that through compensation, right? Because we, not just because we drove top-line sales, but also because we managed our expenses, and there was a category of that, and that would pay out in annual bonuses. And I think that's, I don't know that necessarily generosity. I think it is generosity because it's the owners sharing in the profits of the business. It was over and above our basic compensation. It was over and above our basic job description for all intents and purposes. As a sales manager, I was supposed to drive sales, right? And when I was a sales manager in the early days, And I didn't have, I'm talking about my previous employers before that company, I didn't have any responsibility to expenses. Nobody cared about bottom line. They were just like, drive the top line, drive the top line. You know, I'm crushing the numbers out of the water. I'm not worried if we're getting chargebacks that much. I'm not worried, you know, now you make that part of my compensation plan, I'll change my strategy. But
it's amazing how that works.
What happened was over the years, as you learn that, as you become your own business owner and you start realizing the impact that has, you're like, yeah, it just doesn't feel right. Yeah, I might be getting paid more, but the company's not benefiting from that sale. So that doesn't really make sense. And by introducing that concept of stewardship throughout our organization, we had a lot more discipline, not all of them, but we had a lot more disciplined people that did the right thing that helped our organization grow and was more efficient with, you know, our expenses and things like that. And that was because of the generosity of the owners, because the owners shared in those profits and allowed us to financially benefit from our discipline in the business. I think that was huge. And again, I'm a huge proponent of that strategy. And I think that in many organizations where you see similar strategies being executed, it plays itself out, right? Those people demonstrate that stewardship and carry that torch from, you know, one leadership group to the next.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I mean, just the concept of generosity, right? I think part of it is, you know, you want to enjoy the business that you're working in, and you want your people that work with you and are building your business to enjoy it as well. And I think that's a great way to do it. And, you know, sometimes, you know, it's tough and you may not always have the finances to be as generous as you'd like. And you can do things with, you know, time off or flexible work. And, you know, there's ways you can do that even in the lean years, but in those fat years, you know, really using that as an opportunity to reward key people, you know, make sure they're happy, make sure they feel invested in the business. It's a great retention strategy. It's a great morale strategy. It's a great way to boost performance. So there's, you know, that piece of it, but I also think just, man, it feels good when you can reward your people as a you know, a small business owner. The gratification of that and the stories of, you know, lives changed. And I mean, you've dealt with this over the years, but, you know, people that, you know, finally bought their first house or, you know, paid off debt or, you know, things like that. Just, I mean, you can't really quantify that as a business owner, but it's amazing when you can make it happen.
No, and I would be remiss if I didn't add in Express Club.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's great.
I mean, that was probably the epitome. I mean, I completely almost missed that, but that would have been the epitome of you know, generosity, because I think through those experiences that we had over the years of being able to go to our annual retreat, for lack of a better, right, and take the top 10% of sales performers in the organization and go on those trips that we went on. Yeah, and those were some of the best life experiences I had, right? That I got to share with my wife, and actually years later with my daughter, even because she was part of the organization and was qualified to go to the trip one year. So you think about that, and then talk about the gratification of the owners. The owners get to share time with people who are truly bought into the organization and really, they don't just, I mean, you know, you mentioned the ability for me to hear from somebody, hey, I paid off my house, I did this, I did that because of what I'm able to do, because what the kind of money I make, or the life that I've been able to make here at this organization because you value me and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Some of my favorite times were at Express Club. You know me, I'm always looking to try to get the edge with my team, right? So I walk around to each of my top performers, and I'm like, I would bypass the employee and go right to the spouse, and I'd be like, so how's your husband or wife enjoying the trip so far? And they're like, this has been phenomenal. Yeah. I can't tell you, this is amazing. I understand now why you work so hard, or she worked so hard for us to go to this event. It's so worth it. This has been amazing. I got this, I got that, I got this gift, I got that gift. We did this trip, we did that trip. And I'd be like, great, do me a favor. Make sure they work just as hard to get back here next year so you can be here with me next year again. And it was like, they were like, oh, this is amazing. This is like, you know, like, I'm going to make sure they get back to work next year.
Absolutely.
But, just when you talk about generosity, that was probably the epitome of what we did at that organization, what the owners did for us, and what we were able to extend with that. But that was yet another example of something pretty exceptional that we did. Yeah, and I strongly encourage any owner to kind of consider that type of opportunity.
Yeah. I was just going to say, whatever your your finances look like as an organization, whatever your scale looks like, do what you can where you are with what you have to make the lives of your employees better. And I think, we tend to think of that as, just, I paid them to show up, right? Isn't that enough? But there's
No,
so many
it's
other things,
not.
even little things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not enough. It's not enough in this world today. And
Yeah.
you see that probably even more than I do. But
Yeah.
that's a huge piece right now, is that's not enough. And you've got to go above and beyond. And this is a great example of that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's good. Yeah, I think it's oddly enough something we're both passionate about. So it's
yeah,
good. Yeah. It just, if you're hearing us talk about these big trips and things, maybe you can't do that today. Make that a goal for, a year or two from now. But what could you do today? What could you do this year? And start setting aside a little budget for that, and, get some sponsors, and, set a goal for your team. Hey, if we can, make this happen, I can reward you guys this way. And you can get creative with it if you put in the time and effort. And so don't think about this as, being miserly, but where can we save some money over here to be generous over here? And I think that's something that every business owner should be thinking about.
Yeah, agreed. And you can't buy you couldn't possibly buy the level of respect and appreciation that you get from an employee when you truly understand, what they value and what you value, and you can kind of come together on a success, on an accomplishment of some sort, and actually reward the team accordingly. That goes years into the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So awesome.
if there's an expense that you have to find a way to allocate, it isn't in fact an efficient expense. That would be one of them.
There you go. Nice. Well said. Yeah. Brought it full circle there. Well done.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, hey, let me review a couple key points and just kind of touch base on a couple action items that I'd love to hear what you've got going on over at My Biz Coaches. So a few things that we want to make sure our audience gets from today's episode. First of all, closely monitor your expenses, especially your variable expenses. Super important. And then we didn't spend as much time on this, but really establishing metrics for your organization that relate to expenses and keeping it in line with your growth, whether that's a percentage of sales or some other metric. Really important. Really tight control on inventory and asset management. And then utilizing, tools and technology that are available to automate and digitize. That's going to help reduce those growth-related expenses and maximize profitability. Eric would have given his left leg for that when he was running his ice cream business. So utilize technology to your advantage. Regularly renegotiate terms with suppliers. And if needed, line up alternative suppliers until you get a supplier or a vendor that really feels like a partner for your business. Make sure you're evaluating fixed costs as well, and really look for opportunities to reward your team. So a couple action items for today: determine what KPIs your business will use to gauge expense efficiency, benchmark your expense management against similar businesses, leverage digital tools to streamline expense and inventory management, and set up a regular rhythm for evaluating both variable and fixed costs. And that is going to put you on the right path toward efficient expenses. So as we wrap up here, Eric, we'd love to hear what's new over at My Biz Coaches. I think you've got a couple cool events coming up. So you want to talk about them?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate it, David. So next week, Thursday the 9th, here in Scottsdale, Arizona, we'll be a vendor at an event. The Phoenix Metro Chamber of Commerce is hosting one of their biannual vendor events. And so there'll be 40 vendors and 300 to 400 attendees there. We're super excited. We're announcing a new partnership at that event. So we're not saying anything until then, but we're offering a new solution for our clients based on this partnership. So we're super excited to be able to announce that. That'll be the first time it'll be available at on that date at that event. So if people were looking for coaching and considering getting coaching, but were maybe struggling with the price point, we've got some pretty aggressive offers at that event specifically. So you have to be at the event to get the event pricing. So I encourage you to come by and check it out. If you're outside of the Phoenix metro area and wouldn't be able to attend, but you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to us at info@mybizcoaches.com.
Awesome.
And then, in a couple of weeks, we have our live event David made me break out the news a couple of weeks ago. And so it's on the books. It's April 7th and 8th. It's all day from 8:30 until 5:30, Friday, April 7th. And then we'll have, there will be, for the VIP attendees, there'll be a dinner with the speakers that'll be there. And we'll be announcing the speakers here pretty soon. And then Saturday the 8th, again, from 8:30 to 5:30. So pretty excited about that. This is the first time we've ever brought a number of our clients as well as potential clients together. Got a stable of really awesome speakers, a couple that have popped in on here already on the show. So I'm excited about that, be able to spend some quality time with those individuals. And a lot of amazing content for myself and some of the other coaches here at my Biz Coaches. So we're super excited about the opportunity.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, hey, Eric, I'm going to ask you just one more thing. Sorry, it ties to our topic here today. Expenses. That's a big part of what you do with your clients as a coach, but you also have a tool. You have a Jumpstart 12 that I think can really help people better understand efficient expenses. So if you wouldn't mind, you want to touch on that for just a quick minute?
Yeah, appreciate that. So a great, our proprietary software allows us to go through 12 key components of your business. And when we go through those areas of your business, we uncover opportunities to generate incremental revenue. But there's also a particular area where we talk about and focus on your costs. We actually have one of our coaches actually has a 5-week training course that's just designed to teach a business owner on how to manage their P&L, how to understand how to read and manage their P&L and balance sheets. But specifically to your point, what we do is we go through and we analyze your expenses and help you recognize where you can save money. Often that's anywhere from 5 to 10% of your annualized overall revenue. So for instance, if you were doing $500,000 a year, 10% of that, we'd say we probably uncover as much as up to $50,000, but as much as $5,000 to $25,000 in expenses that are going out the window that probably don't need to be.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think, a lot of business owners, I mean, even myself included, didn't start the business because we love managing finances. And so I think, get a coach, get somebody that kind of geeks out over this stuff, that can help you understand it, that can help you, look for those opportunities in your business and increase profitability. And so I know Eric definitely can do that. I know a number of his coaches, and they can certainly do that. And they've got a lot of great tools that can help with that. So if that's not your forte, you get a pass if you run a bookkeeping firm and you're watching this. But otherwise, if that's not your forte,